but just define or just unpack that term that you've had on your website.
Sure. And a lot of people tend to get very angry very quickly, reasonably, when they see that, wait a minute, trauma is what happens in my brain. Like, it's my brain just like, obviously, if we're talking things like oppression, atrocities, genocide, war, assault on either a personal level or a collective level, global, there are things that are bad. There are events that are inherently traumatic, which is why, especially nowadays with trauma being such a buzzy, quote, trendy word, as a trauma expert, it's really important to me to define what we're talking about. So a traumatic event is those events that I just listed, things that we can all get together and agree are bad. Like, they are bad. There is no subjective interpretation. Assault is bad. Genocide is bad. All of those things are bad. Trauma, as that word is defined, is the internal process. I like to call it the brain's digestion process. So if you're subject to a traumatic event, which is the external, your brain is reasonably going to not metabolize that. Just like if you were to ingest contaminated food, you're going to get sick. Like, maybe there are a few people who don't get sick when they eat poisoned food, but generally the majority of us, when exposed to bacteria in our food or a traumatic event, are going to experience trauma. But that said, you can also experience trauma, the internal brain indigestion process, from events that nobody would ever even think of as traumatic. Now, that doesn't mean I'm comparing them. So let's say you get into a minor car accident and suddenly you can't sleep and you're shaking and you're sweating and you're panicking. I'm not comparing a fender bender to genocide. I am saying that our brains do brain things, and what gets coded in one person's body as indigestion might not necessarily be for the other. And on the reverse, you can be exposed to traumatic events and not actually get PTSD and not sustain long-term trauma, just like you can be exposed to something that we wouldn't necessarily code as a traumatic event, and nevertheless, here we are. So a traumatic event is the external, trauma is the internal metabolic, quote, the way I frame it, process.
Okay, so that's pretty profound. So what you're saying is certain people can experience an event like a car accident, and it doesn't cause trauma in their bodies. And I refer to trauma as a wound. And you're referring to that wound in the brain system, which is very interesting because I've been a doctor of Chinese medicine for 24 years now. You know, I've dealt with a lot of patients with regards to functional medicine and using all different types of techniques, from functional medicine to ozone to acupuncture to herbal medicine, which has been very sort of profound and helpful for my patients. But it's just interesting how someone can have a car accident and it can sort of, someone else got injured or the car was written off and they don't have that wound, or the wound is very small, that they just normal life and daily, they just process it and it doesn't cause a long-term wound that causes a trigger. While others have a wound, a deep wound that causes significant problems, especially with regards to car accidents. So why are certain people, you know, firstly, they have an event and it causes a wound, it causes a deep wound that then they have to deal with and process in order for not to trigger certain sort of behavioral coping mechanisms?
Sure. And I wish I had a neat and clean answer to that. I can tell you it's certainly not a question of strength versus weakness, or a good person versus a bad person, or a moral person. It's not about anything logical or anything cognitive. Our brains and our bodies are made up, and you know this, of just the nuance is infinite. Genetics, environments, childhood, caregivers, family of origin, community support, levels of external resources, level of internal resilience, which can be defined by lots of things and mitigated by lots of things. You know, someone with really, really strong, you know, internal organs who is super healthy might have an easier time with a psychological trauma. I'm not saying that's always the case. Certainly that's not always the case. But why some people experience trauma and others is way too complex for anyone really to answer. My short, very reductive answer is because our brains our brains do brain things. And often much of what our brains do is automatic. It's often subject to generations of behavioral patterns of thinking, being, and doing that are passed down. A trauma from my great-great-grandmother could be impacting me today, whereas you don't have that same trauma from your great-great-grandmother. So exposed to the same stimulus, we both react differently. So rather than why did this happen, or why is my body reacting like this, which is an interesting question, a much better approach is, what are my options? What are my resources in this moment to help myself get back to baseline? Because we can answer the why and still feel stuck. We can answer the why and still feel terrible. So rather than why the trauma, what's our solution, and what are my choices in this moment? The why question is important and it's interesting, but it's certainly not the first line of defense when you're suffering.